So as Adrian said, I grew up on Standing Rock. I've lived here in the Northeast for many years now, working with tribal communities, and was drawn into organizing and assisting family members, essentially. And what I wanted to start with was just a very short, I think it's about 1.5 or 2-minute video that was one of the first videos that was shot with drone footage. Adrian mentioned Dean Dedman, who's a distant cousin of my brother's and mine, and John, my brother, and Dean teamed up beginning in about February of 2016, so just over 2 years ago. And Dean had recently purchased a drone and started filming community organizing and some of the first actions that were happening on Standing Rock as folks were trying to raise awareness in our communities and in all of our Oceti communities who live along the Missouri River. So I wanted to share this brief video just as a way of introducing you to the movement as it was seen from the sky through Dean's camera work beginning, I believe this was posted in March or April, so just about 2 years ago.
Those deep wounds of our ancestors still bleed within our hearts. When we remember all they've done, that's where the healing starts. So every morning when you wake, you pray this prayer out loud. Creator, help me live in a way that would make my ancestors proud.
We will rise up from the darkness.
Don't you forget this. You can be anything you want to be.
We will overcome the
Just work hard, never give up. Perseverance is the key.
For your spirits live within
Strength,
us.
dignity, honor, that's all in your family tree. So hold your head up high and know that.
We shall remain. We will rise up from the darkness.
Creator, help me live in a way that will make my ancestors proud.
We will overcome the pain.
Creator, help me live in a way that will make my ancestors proud.
For your spirits live within us.
Creator, help me live in a way that will make my ancestors proud.
We shall remain.
Little brother, we will rise up from this darkness. Little brother, we will overcome the pain. Remember, warrior spirits live within us. We shall remain.
Okay, so my apologies. That's actually a video that was shot in August, so it's not one of the earliest videos, but it is one of the first ones that Dean was able to edit. Just gonna make sure it's turned off here. There we go. So as I said, I live here in New England. Our family started hearing about this pipeline threat as early as 2012. And I just really wanted to take us back a little bit to frame where the movement began and why there was such a need for footage to be gathered by the hundreds of drone pilots who eventually arrived on the scene. And I always like to foreground the young people who really led the movement initially. This young woman, Bobby Jean Three Legs, is one of my personal heroes, who was a fantastic community organizer and an extremely savvy social media live streamer and poster. And she was one of the first young people to really take up the charge in terms of organizing some of the spirit runs that gathered runners as young as 6 years old, all the way up into young people in their 20s. And this group of young people organized a huge number of events, starting with a spirit run from Wôpanâag, which is a community along the river, across the river. So the idea initially was to try to get non-native tribal communities involved in organizing against the pipeline. This group of young people initially called itself the Oceti-Sakowin Youth and Allies, and they also worked very closely with our Standing Rock Tribal Youth Council. And there's a wonderful website that's still online called respectourwater.com, where they shared many of their stories of growing up fishing and playing in the river and what that river means to our families on Standing Rock. And this is a group of young people who initiated a change.org petition, which eventually gathered over 500,000 signatures. Our council on Standing Rock, our elected leadership officials, actually passed a standing resolution in opposition to pipeline development and oil development on Standing Rock and in our treaty territories as early as 2012. And this was really initiated in response to some of the early organizing opposing the Keystone XL pipeline. And it's really the early Keystone pipeline opposition efforts that inspired some of these treaty camps and prayer camps that eventually emerged on Standing Rock. And I also always love to share links and details from this very early September 30th, 2014 meeting that happened between our tribal council and executives from Energy Transfer Partners, because it's been very famously reported in lots of media outlets that we didn't speak up early enough. We didn't reach out and express our opposition in any documented way. So I'm happy to share with anyone who would like links, my slides, and the link at the bottom is a 39-page transcript of our Tribal Historic Preservation Office team and our Tribal Council leadership expressing their unqualified opposition to Energy Transfer Partners staff. The second link is a YouTube video of this hour or so long meeting in which Energy Transfer Partners executives were warned repeatedly that this standing resolution existed and that our communities completely opposed this pipeline and that it would not be something that people would just be willing to accept. This is a beautiful image from one of Myron's drones that I pulled off the internet at some point. I have him credited down in the bottom. But this is in the top left corner, People Stand with a Strong Heart. This is the Community Action Collective that started meeting in February 2016, once our families realized that Energy Transfer Partners was really unwavering in their plans to build this pipeline right on our northern border. And so folks as early as February and March started envisioning prayer camps, sort of modeled on the Keystone XL pipeline opposition that had taken place down further south in South Dakota and in Nebraska. And on April 1st, the Camp of the Sacred Stone was established. That is in the lower right corner of the image. And then gradually by mid-August, mid to late August, we started to see a huge outpouring of support from Oceti-Sakowin and other tribal nations. So a much larger overflow camp was established. That's the northernmost image you see in the photo there. And because of the Rosebud Sioux tribe's leadership in the Keystone XL pipeline opposition, they actually brought a huge delegation and they established their own camp known as Sichongu Camp or Rosebud Camp. So Sacred Stone was the only camp that was located within our reservation lands. The two camps at the top of the image, the northernmost Oceti-Sakowin camp is established on land that was taken from Standing Rock by the Army Corps of Engineers during a massive dam buildup process in the 1950s, where they flooded over 50,000 acres of Standing Rock tribal land and over 100,000 acres of Cheyenne River Sioux land, which is the reservation just south of us. So for those of us who grew up on Standing Rock, we've really heard about the Army Corps' ill intentions and the lengths that they've been willing to go to dispossess us of our homelands and some of the most beautiful and productive parts of our reservation. Our entire lives, we grew up hearing about grandparents who sang death songs when they were forced from their cabins as children and when they watched their gardens flooded and timberlands flooded, grazing lands. There's a huge amount of habitat destruction that happened, and this is from the late 1950s into the early 1960s. And this didn't just happen to Standing Rock, this happened to 7 or 8 indigenous communities along the Missouri River, all the way up through South Dakota, North Dakota, and into Montana. So that may give you a little bit more insight into some of the unqualified opposition that you saw among the young people in our community. And for those of us who have been fortunate to inherit land rights or allotment pieces from our ancestors, some of the land that we have inherited is literally under the water, under the reservoir that the Army Corps of Engineers has created. So I'm going to keep my comments brief because I'm not an expert in drones, and I didn't participate in gathering the imagery that we're here to talk about today. But I just want to quickly go through a couple of images, and like I said, I'm willing to share my slides with you. The Standing Rock Dakota Access Pipeline opposition page was a Facebook community that my younger brother set up in February 2016. So it was one of the first community-based Facebook pages. And at that point, as I mentioned, this is one of our distant cousins, Dean, who he was working with at the community radio station. And they started filming actions that the community was using to bring attention to the Army Corps of Engineers as they were performing their first visits to Standing Rock to inform people about this pipeline construction process. So Dean and John coordinated footage of a 4 Directions march and run in early April. They filmed Bobby Jean's youth run in March, and they were there when Bobby Jean and maybe 2 of her friends set off for their first run to the Army Corps of Engineers in Nebraska on an early morning in late April, so just about 2 years ago. And as I mentioned, Dean was volunteering at the radio station, but as things began to get more heated later on in the summer, so by early August, the drone, one of the drones that he had crashed, and the radio station replaced his drone. But then they decided, once law enforcement started showing up on the scene, that they weren't comfortable with him filming nonviolent direct actions or people who were directly placing their bodies in the line of construction, and they actually took the drone away from him. There were concerns from our community radio board about footage that was gathered by one of their volunteers. They operate under an FCC license, and at this point, mid to late August, we're already talking about 3 or 4 months of community members on Standing Rock seeing pickup trucks of armed mercenaries cruising around on the back roads, deliberately intimidating people, men with, lots of facial hair, masks sometimes. Dean had seen some sniper nests on hilltops with his drone. And so there was really starting to be an atmosphere of fear and intimidation in some of our communities, unfortunately. So Dean and my brother called me up one day in late August, right before Labor Day weekend, and they were like, Uncle Virgil took the drone. The radio station took the drone back. They don't want us to film any confrontations with law enforcement, and can you get us a new drone? And, I didn't really know what to say, but just a few days later, our tribe filed paperwork with the federal court to document where some of the sacred sites were, to demonstrate to the for our tribe's court case that pipeline construction was in fact going to be destroying sacred sites. And the construction crews skipped over about 10 or 15 miles of open construction area, and they went to work one weekend morning over Labor Day weekend directly on top of these sites, presumably once they had access to this new filing with the court. And it was a horrible thing to witness online. I saw lots of really panicked videos of friends and loved ones who were being attacked by dogs, and women who are carrying children. And fortunately, Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! Were there, because if they hadn't been, I know that the North Dakota media and a predominantly non-native mainstream media in the Northern Plains would have continued to outright dismiss the experiences of my loved ones. and to reinforce what was, even by then in early August, a really popular narrative in North Dakota news that the tribe hadn't spoken up. We were really just after money. Our young people were violent, that there were calls for weapons in these camps, and that people were threatening pipeline crews, and there was just so much misinformation coming from the North Dakota media. And so I think it was Sunday afternoon, I got on my brother's page and on my own Facebook page, and I posted a crowdfunding request. And my brother was a little upset with me because he was always really adamant that he didn't want his page to be used as a way to make money. He never wanted to make any money off this movement. He never wanted to engage in any crowdfunding. But I explained to him that the drones that he and Dean had requested were, well over $1,000, and that if they wanted their drones to be replaced, then I needed help. And literally by Monday morning, I had enough money to purchase the first drone. So I sent that to Dean and to my brother, and within a couple of weeks, some students at UMass Amherst and a couple of teach-ins in Mashpee and some other community events helped us raise enough money for another piece of equipment, a whole set of drone and supporting materials, as well as things like keyboards and phone chargers and all kinds of supplies. So like I said, I'm going to skip through most of these slides. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with this rapid escalation of police violence over a 6 to 8 week period, which is one of the reasons I wanted to share that initial video with you, where you see our elders and our young people horseback riding through these beautiful open fields, and you see this vision that Dean had for calling people to support our youth and to support our families. And it really was coming from a very sincere place of prayerfulness. And eventually there were more than 80 law enforcement agencies that responded to quell these so-called riots. This top left picture on the screen is the so-called riot of Indigenous Peoples Day. You can see that people literally put up a teepee and were sitting inside that frame and were praying. This was one of the first instances where there started to be a lot of social media attention to Standing Rock and the No Dapple and Water is Life hashtags, because a young actress named Shailene Woodley was arrested on October 12th, and she live streamed the entire event on her Facebook page while about 33,000 people watched. These other images, I know that Myron's going to show you footage that he shot from later on in October and November, but I always like to point out that literally the only weapon that was ever recovered in one of these encampments was in possession of an Energy Transfer Partners Dakota Access Pipeline security worker, and that's this young man you see in the picture being disarmed by a Bureau of Indian Affairs officer. Just a few quick photos of some additional drone footage. This December image on the left is from a group of young people from Oklahoma who operated an organization called N1TB, and they were live casting and live streaming their drone footage the weekend when several thousand, maybe upwards of 4,000 veterans arrived on Standing Rock. And that was at the same time when the Obama administration famously, called for a pause in the construction. We could spend a lot of time talking about the achievements of the movement. As I said, I'm willing to share my slides with you, but I really always want to highlight just the fact that, there was a very short window of time, maybe 9 or 10 months, where not only our Oceti-Sakowin people felt completely united in our efforts in protecting our homelands, and there was a growing international awareness of Indigenous peoples' common struggles. So that was one of the reasons there was so much resonance for the struggle that our families were undertaking, was because everyone had a story of their own river or their own water sources being contaminated or stolen from them. And that really led to this tremendous outpouring that we saw on social media, and eventually through some attention in the mainstream media. There was also all these really important advances that happened in our communities around equity and leadership, where men, women, two-spirit communities, and our young people were able to share leadership roles. There was all this incredible intergenerational ceremony and song and prayer that was being shared, and this really lasting commitment to nonviolent direct action. So despite the fact there were over 800 arrests, there were no violent incidents where people were arrested for assaulting an officer or any kind of altercations of that nature. I think what people saw and what we'll see in footage that Myron shares is that much of the violence that was enacted in these spaces was state-sponsored violence. You know, the state of North Dakota spent upwards of $33 million policing these so-called protests. And I always like to give a quick sense of how much is still happening. So there is presently an excessive force class action lawsuit that has been filed against Morton County and the sheriff who managed all of these actions. Our elders and our treaty councils are looking at all the ways that they can pursue human rights violations, charges, and attention through human rights mechanisms at the level of the United Nations, in terms of calling out the constitutional and treaty rights violations, as well as violations of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as human rights. And our tribe's case is still actually pending. There's very little attention or understanding of that, but the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe and Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe are still suing the Army Corps, despite the fact that there is no spill response plan. The pipeline company is allowed to continue operating, though the judge has not yet ruled. Energy Transfer Partners has sued everyone from our family members individually on Standing Rock. Luckily, that strategic lawsuit against public participation was dismissed last summer. They've also sued organizations like Greenpeace and Sierra Club, charging them under the Federal RICO Act. And there are still over 170 cases pending against water protectors in North Dakota court. There are also landowners in Iowa who are still waiting for their day in court over the eminent domain land takings that violate their state's constitution. And recently, this top right image that you see is from the National Association of Counties. And we've started to see a tremendous amount of information sharing that's happening among counties, the National Sheriff's Association, this whole range of big oil industry trade groups, and also organizations like the highly conservative American Legislative Exchange Council. So now there are almost 24 extremely punitive anti-protester laws, some that have already been passed in states. And we've also seen this really troubling precedent be set by this administration in terms of publishing their intention to conduct a thorough environmental impact statement that's mandated under a number of federal laws, but then was just arbitrarily and unilaterally halted by the President Trump's executive action very soon after he took office. So I just want to highlight that these are things that are still very much ongoing, and I won't take any more of your time because we have two fantastic speakers, but as I said, I'm really eager to share slides and resources with you if you are interested in accessing some of these links to be able to continue to teach about this movement, about the tremendous work that's happening all over the world in terms of the divestment work that's happening. And there's still really a lot happening on Standing Rock as well. Out of Sacred Stone Camp, Sacred Stone Village is now a local community organization focused on green energy and youth projects. And it's also been tremendously exciting to see the energy that the youth have still managed to harness and to stay attuned to despite everything that they've endured. And I can't imagine being a teenager and going through these types of devastating disappointments and just really devastating instances of injustice in our legal system and at the hands of this administration, but they're still continuing to lead us and to be tremendous sources of inspiration for our communities. So thank you very much for your time. And as I said, I'm very much willing to share my slides with you if you would like to be able to access any of these links. Thank you.
Hi, I want to thank Adrian and Greg and Stephanie and Caitlin and Christina for organizing this event and inviting me. I'm honored to be here, especially on this panel with Jennifer and Myron. I feel very privileged to be here. The image that you see here was included in an October 18, 2016 PowerPoint presentation from the private security firm Tiger Swan, which was hired by Energy Transfer Partners to monitor DAPL protesters for 9 months. It features a gorilla in the clouds watching over the Standing Rock camp and appeared at the end of a daily intelligence update after slides. So you have to imagine you're in an intelligence update and you first get this slide, and I'm not going to show all of them, but just to give you a sense of some of the things in the deck of slides. You get weather and light data and assessment, priority intelligence requirements, and then like this slide at the end. Any questions? So the image sardonically uses a gorilla overlord to project Tiger Swan's omniscience and invincibility in relation to the comparatively tiny water protectors below. The image also reveals how Tiger Swan's security workers think about themselves and the protesters. And I opened my comments with this strange image, not only to point out Tiger Swan's quirky and belittling tone, but also to signal the importance of the vertical field. That continuous space between the air and underground, and the power relations that have been mobilized through it in the battle to protect water at Standing Rock. I approached drone-based DAPL protests as a media scholar who's written about vertical space, the air, airwaves, orbit, and ground, and power relations between them, focusing on uses of drones and satellites in an array of militarized contexts. I followed the DAPL protests as they unfolded and have spoken informally with Native and non-Native people involved in the protests. I've discussed drone use by Myron, Dewey, and Dean Dedman with my students and watched some of their drone videos and the powerful, here's Dean Dedman, and the powerful documentary film, Awake, which Dewey co-directed. I've also read documents released in FOIA requests and leaks, and work by Janet Walker, who's exploring how independent media and mapping at Standing Rock create propositions for more just ways of being. I am not an expert on Native American cultures. My comments tonight are intended to encourage further critical awareness of the relations between vertical power, drone technology, and publics, and to draw attention to the surveillance strategies and discourses of state and federal officers in their efforts to criminalize civilian drone use by water protectors. I also want to support further organizing by tribes in their efforts to claim sovereignty over the airspace above their territories. I want to start with a discussion of the FAA's temporary flight restriction orders, which created a no-fly zone above the DAPL protest area from October 25th to December 13, 2016. During this time, law enforcers in the North Dakota Highway Patrol, Department of Emergency Services, and State Radio communicated with FAA officials in Washington, D.C., requesting implementation of a TFR, or a no-fly zone. A no-fly zone of almost 154 square miles was in place from October 25 to November 4, and a smaller area was renewed twice until December 13. And I want to kind of go through this correspondence that was released in FOIA so we get a sense of what this discourse is like among federal and state officials that are trying to do something about this situation. So in an October 23rd email to the FAA that laid the grounds for the TFR, North Dakota officials characterized the protesters as, quote, violent and as, quote, organizing and deploying paramilitary-style actions, end quote, that compelled law enforcers to intensify aerial surveillance in order to, quote, provide overwatch for security of the officers on the ground, end quote. In their back and forth, FAA officials coached North Dakota law enforcers, coached them about how to make a, quote, solid case for reestablishing the TFR. For instance, on November 3rd, an FAA officer emphasized the need to address, quote, the 3 triggering threats that had been outlined earlier, and to get it substantiated by federal law enforcement officers on the ground. He also urged the North Dakota official to insert new information about ongoing threats. And the FAA, I'm sorry if you can't see this, but this PS and PPS at the bottom are kind of important, at least in my reading of these documents. So the FAA indicated in a PS at the end of a November 4th email, quote, a typical scenario for our use of this provision would be people firing at law enforcement aircraft in the area, e.g. Ferguson, drawing a comparison between the situation at Standing Rock and the 2014 protests in Ferguson, Missouri. FAA staff also stressed that, quote, a credible ongoing threat that has an aviation nexus would make for a stronger argument, end quote. In response, the North Dakota agencies expanded their rationale for the TFR renewal on the grounds that, number 1, they needed to keep the sky clear for helicopters fighting fires. Number 2, a series of near misses between various aircraft had happened. Number 3, they alleged use of high-power laser pointers and spotlights by those on the ground intended to, quote, blind pilots overhead. And number 4, private drones flying in, quote, a dangerous manner immediately over law enforcement officials, end quote. The request went on to claim that, quote, UAS, or drones, have often operated at face level and have recently attempted to enter law enforcement vehicles, end quote, and have, quote, deliberately flown, quote, at response aircraft and watercraft. So while one FAA official did mention tribes' concerns about First Amendment infringements, law enforcers were ultimately more concerned about preventing their own activities from appearing in live drone feeds. As one North Dakota officer put it, quote, we need to ensure the movement of law enforcers trying to protect the innocent is not being broadcast live by the use of drones, end quote. An email on November 21st from North Dakota to FAA reported 4 to 5 small drones flying in the TFR last night, harassing our law enforcement officers, end quote, and went on to identify one of the suspects whose name was redacted, operating a drone live feed on the indie media website Unicorn Riot. The email message also identified the suspect's Facebook page, which was redacted, demonstrating the state's commandeering of social media as a surveillance platform. None of the FAA email messages mentioned that law enforcers were using tear gas, rubber bullets, or water cannons against protesters on November 20, and that more than 300 people were injured, revealing a serious blind spot in their concerns and discussions. So several key issues emerge when examining this correspondence. Number 1 is the tight coordination between state and federal agencies in defining protesters' drone use as violent and dangerous. Number two, I want to highlight the paternalistic claim to the vertical field as a zone of, quote, overwatch. It's used again and again. It's a euphemism for surveillance and privacy and First Amendment infringements. And overwatch to protect the law enforcers, and again you hear protection of peaceful demonstrators. And then there's the inability to recognize the importance of drone video for protesters and instead to criminalize protesters' drone use and activities. And finally, the articulation of drone-based protests with other social movements deemed to be threatening to national security. And throughout these documents, you hear not only about Ferguson, you hear Black Lives Matter, reference to the Black Panthers, there's a racialization of the conflict, Earth First, the American Indian movement. The list of anxiety goes on in terms of these issues. So beyond the FAA file, The Intercept has published records from Tiger Swan, the private security firm that Energy Transfer Partners hired to monitor protesters and gather evidence that could be used to prosecute POIs or persons of interest. Tiger Swan had done security and mercenary work in Afghanistan and Iraq, and in its analysis, The Intercept emphasizes the firm's application of military-style counterterrorism measures upon the water protectors. Tiger Swan's staff not only compared protesters to jihadist fighters and terrorists, a September 9, 2016 report from the firm noted, quote, the presence of additional Palestinians in the camp, end quote, and claimed, quote, the movement's involvement with Islamic individuals is a dynamic that requires further examination, end quote. Ethnic and racial profiling by Tiger Swan's staff was common as well. And in counterterrorism parlance, members of certain groups were referred to as, quote, cells. This war on terror mindset was also evident in the leaked records of the so-called Intel group as well. This group included an armada of federal officers from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, FBI, US Marshals, the DOJ, and one exchange claimed there was, quote, a strong female Shia Islamic following, end quote, among the protesters. The Intel group was particularly fixated on watching live feeds via drones and social media, commandeering protesters' social media posts as their own intelligence data, marking the thin line between sharing and surveillance. North Dakota Fusion Center generated this diagram of suspects in September 2016, identifying Black Lives Matter and anonymous connections as well. Though drone activists were blocked from the air during temporary flight restriction, although they weren't all blocked, but there was an order in place, Tiger Swan was allowed to continue its aerial surveillance and used a live video feed from a private Dakota Access security helicopter to monitor protesters' movements. The firm also used a small Phantom 4 drone to, quote, overwatch. North Dakota police also continued aerial surveillance, and its airplane was tracked by protesters on the ground. I'm really interested in how people on the ground were tracking upward and documenting and identifying various aircraft as sweeping too low and creating unsafe conditions. So it's crucial to recognize that civilian drone use has intensified political struggles over the air and has led to a bolstering of state power in the name of security, of national security. Increasingly, we see, not only in this situation, but I would say even more generally, these war on terror agencies and mindsets and measures are applied in contexts that may be totally irrelevant to the war on terror, resulting in a kind of counterterrorism creep that has literally become atmospheric in this case, where it's really about this vertical space and use of technologies to materialize it. So while a focus on the empowering aspects of drone activism can generate hope and optimism, I want to suggest it's also important to recognize these strategies of federal and state officials and private security workers used to remove water protectors' drones from the air, as these workers tried regulatory mechanisms, shooting at them while they were in the sky and seizing them on the ground. These aggressive and violent actions are part of historical struggles that have played out through the vertical field, from the air to the underground, and involve issues of eminent domain, sovereignty, and free speech. In 2005, Stacy Leeds, a lawyer and member of the Cherokee Nation, encouraged tribes to, quote, exercise their eminent domain powers in order to reacquire and consolidate their land base. As Dewey and other anti-DAPL drone activists have argued, tribal claims of eminent domain extend to the airspace as well. In his comments on the no-fly zone, Dewey explained, quote, I told the FAA the difference between how we're approaching this is that I'm exercising sovereignty. I feel kind of strange reading the quote when he's sitting right here. and then he said, if you want to bring up a no-fly zone, you need to go to the tribal council and make your request to them. I think that quote is so important, among many other quotes from Myron. A basic principle of international aviation law is that a sovereign nation is entitled to, quote, complete and exclusive sovereignty over the airspace above its territory. Lawyer Sandra Shippey, member of the Native American Practice Group in California, suggests, quote, tribes could assert that air traffic above tribal lands could pose a risk or threat to tribal citizens or the tribal government. Also, she says, tribes should have a right to protect its citizens from aircraft noise, air pollution, aviation accidents, and other impositions from low-flying aircraft. Multiple reports from DAPL protesters indicate that law enforcers' aircraft flew very low and was mobilized to intimidate them. For instance, as Lorraine Meadows eloquently put it in Native News, quote, the North Dakota sky over Standing Rock beats almost continuously with a pulse of propeller blades. The tempo is changed by the number of helicopters, planes, and drones, speeding and slowing the beat in a sinister arrhythmia, taunting the water protectors below. Each thump of the displaced air reminds water protectors that they are being watched, followed, tracked, and attacked, their civil and human rights stripped with the approval of the FAA. The DAPL protests are just one example of the need for further assertions of tribal sovereignty over airspace. This is a complex and important issue that I hope we will continue on here on after, but I just want to highlight this important article and this detailed legal analysis of this issue. Lawyer and member of the Seminole tribe, William, also known as John Haney, argues that, quote, tribes have an inherent sovereign right to regulate tribal airspace, end quote. So, do I have a few more minutes? Okay. I'm just going to do a quick conclusion, and I wanted to play some of Dean Dedman's drone footage as I talk. How do I do, is it this? To make it larger? Okay, there we go. Indeed, beyond claims of eminent domain in the air, tribes have asserted First Amendment rights through the vertical field as well. After Dean Dedman flew a drone to check on the DAPL area and police shot at it, he declared, quote, they shot at my First Amendment right. They shot at a journalist's equipment, end quote. Dedman explained that he was trying to see what they were carrying, whether they have dogs, what weapons they are planning to use in that convoy, according to a video interview with him. In drone activist videos, it's possible to monitor DAPL's construction, excavation, pipe laying, and routing, as well as bulldozers' proximity to and incursions upon sacred lands and water resources. Given that tribal members were blocked off from accessing their own lands, the drone's visual mobility became all the more important, as it enabled tribes to witness and gather evidence from above. People have come together through and around drone views. The views and their creators have inspired and given expression to a vital, new, indigenous, techno-social formation. Standing Rock drone activists have innovated new forms of activism, journalism, flight, environmentalism, and community engagement. Beyond monitoring DAPL's development, drone activists also hovered above blockades and standoffs between law enforcers and protesters, trying to ensure civil rights were protected and providing oversight when they were not. It's worth asking what might have happened if drone live feeds were not running throughout the protests. So just a couple more comments then. While drone use has been empowering among anti-DAPL protesters, it's important to recognize specific efforts by law enforcers, private security firms, and federal agencies from the FAA to the FBI to limit or thwart protesters' drone use. Doing so recognizes the vertical field as a site of power relations and ongoing social struggles. The vertical field includes air, spectrum, orbit, and ground, and whatever is beneath it, and has historically been claimed and colonized by state and corporate entities. One reason that drone surveillance has been so powerful is that it challenged the vertical hegemony of the state. Anti-DAPL drone pilots such as Dewey and Dedman asserted that an eminent domain extended into the airspace above tribal territories and insisted that the air is a site of First Amendment protections. Despite this, law enforcers, security contractors, private companies, and federal agencies work concertedly to assert their power through the vertical field, controlling everything from the sky to the water and oil underground. In the process, representatives of these groups have restricted protesters' air access, damaged and confiscated drone pilots' equipment, intimidated and spied on protesters from low-flying helicopters and aircraft, and compromised breathable air using pepper spray, tear gas, and water cannons. While the standoff between protesters and law enforcers often manifests visually as scenes of militarized equipment on one end and protesters holding hand on the other, it also unfolded through the vertical field as a battle between civilian drones and police airplanes and helicopters, between those protecting water and those protecting oil. In this way, we can understand the DAPL protests as generating a kind of vertical biopolitics. What happened in the air above Standing Rock directly affected bodies, material relations, and life worlds on and underground. It altered where and how people moved, what sites they sought to protect, and what technologies and practices they would use to do so. Drone activist views also served as a call for help that convened thousands at the camp. And I would just close with one last image, which I think is important because I always try to find a little optimism when, especially in these moments today, in these times. So I just want to close with this powerful image that is suggestive of tribes' reclamation of the air above their lands. It's a photo that was taken on the night of December 4th, 2016, in the skies above the Ochati-Saquon camp, after the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers denied an easement for DAPL near the edge of the Sioux Standing Rock Reservation outside of Cannonball, North Dakota. This was a moment of significant victory and jubilee for the water protectors, and it should not be forgotten, as it revealed what was possible through collective action and peaceful protests. While this victory has since been rolled back under Trump and the skies have become stormy with political strife, the sparkle and crackle of these fireworks linger as a powerful declaration of tribal sovereignty and independence at Standing Rock, while also marking the vertical field as a site of ongoing contestation by a collective of tribes, drone activists, Native American lawyers, and non-Native allies. Thank you.
How nana nia ohoba shinami na agaitaka Paiute Shoshone. My name is Myron Dewey, and from the Walker Paiute tribe. And I want to say thank you, ladies. And thank you to Brown University, Adrian. And what you just said at the end about those fireworks, this was the drone that was shot while I was documenting supposedly, the denial, and they had shot this drone and I brought it back. And I actually walked to the sacred fires, get ready to say, you know what, this is BS. This is just another repeat of history. And they were just telling us what we needed to hear. And I didn't want to be the Debbie Downer when I saw people crying and hugging and smiling. And one of the other pilots that was with me, I just said, they asked me if we were going to go join in. I says, no, we got work to do. And we left. So it wasn't a victory at all. It was an example of history repeating itself. And what we witnessed was that over and over and over of false accusations in the media. And at the time of the first Western contact, we didn't have that type of media. And so seeing that a group called the Netizens were hired in propaganda media that came on the ground, another group was hired, which he was identified. I think what was very powerful about this is that we had a collective agenda there in prayer. And it did go at the beginning just to stop a pipeline. But as it escalated, it became unified and it became more spiritual, more powerful, with tribes bringing in their traditional medicines, their collective common struggles as well. And it made it easier to identify who wasn't a part of that prayer. Really easy. And we identify people in the media, we identify people that were coming in for their own agendas. And it became really like somebody who doesn't play, football trying to be the quarterback. That's exactly how it was. Drone pilots were coming in all four directions, media. And it was the opportunity to educate and re-educate America on Indigenous issues that you're never going to learn in the schools. In some colleges you do. And so I took that opportunity to educate. And as a historical trauma trainer, I seen that a lot of the allies had a lot of hurt, a lot of shame, a lot of embarrassment, what they were witnessing. And there were so many people coming from all four directions as the hundreds of people I was checking in with media and just re-educating America on the Indigenous issues, that this wasn't the first time. This was 400, 500, 600 tribes, and many tribes that can't speak up for themselves because they're no longer here. And so it was our responsibility to share their story, to share their songs, to share their words, and also what we were seeing as historical trauma, as current trauma, as a collective with our allies. And the stories that I heard from allies was very powerful about this is their legacy of their families. This is the shame of their families that brought in this military, that brought in this land theft, that brought in the loss of language, the indoctrination. 4,500 veterans that came in that expressed the shame of being on the wrong side of history. The 550 churches that came through and explained the apology with the doctrine of discovery was where it all stemmed. The child abuse, the sexual abuse, the child molestation from boarding schools, the participation in the government agenda to kill the Indian to save the man, Andrew Jackson, the man that hangs behind our president currently today. So as you guys have witnessed, this was already happening to us. We were able to bring to light every single day. And it was not a prophecy that what was happening, it was a repeat of history that was happening. So it was like no new agenda. This is what you see in other countries our country is doing. But to the Indigenous people in this country, and also to Americans. Now I went there in solidarity as a nation to nation, and I exercised that. I never once used my driver's license because I didn't go there as a U.S. citizen. I went there as a agaitaka for my tribe, a representative. And I documented with this media as much as I could to train as many people to protect themselves that did go with the First Amendment, and to re-educate people why we were there and why we were protecting the water, which is our inherent right, which I want to thank, my brother here, John, for taking me out and showing me the waters here, because you can't drink in the water and you probably can't swim in those waters. And this hidden agenda that is now coming to light, that this is happening like Flint, Michigan, like here in Nevada, where you can't drink the water. The tribe cannot drink the water in here in Nevada, right next to a Superfund site where a corporate farmer promotes organic growing. This is something that is just out now in the open, where we've seen agricultural cleansing, as we've seen here with the pipeline doing that they felt on September 3rd, is that if they cleaned out these burial sites where there was no evidence, that they could legally put this pipeline through. What they didn't expect is that we had higher ground from air and to the ground in social media, as well as journalism, community journalism, and the collective prayer that was there at that time going up for a prayer. They were just happened to encounter these bulldozers. And so many things were happening like clockwork. And my goal was to just train, educate, and empower people while we were there, and to make sure that the narrative stayed consistent, that this is an Indigenous-led movement, and it's always been an Indigenous-led movement. At any environmental fight around the world, Indigenous people are in the forefront protecting the earth, because we're still connected to the earth. We're still practicing our ceremonies, our songs, our language, and our way of life. And the people that came there, and many of the Indigenous people that came there, came back to find that piece that was taken from them, that was stolen. And they were taking back their inherent right to protect the water, which many of our allies, our non-natives, are doing, is they're taking back that inherent right to protect the water. That is important. Water is life, and that without it, we won't make it. So I'm going to show a short video that A&J Plus had put together. And I saw these two sisters, Shandi and Dina, who were filming in the West Bank before Standing Rock. I used to watch their live feeds, and they were being shot at. And I was thinking, whoa, this is unreal. And at that time, they had like 6 viewers, sometimes 12. I was number 13, 14 sometimes, They didn't have a really large viewing. And this is really new to Facebook Live. And then sometimes it would be higher depending on what they were showing. And this got me motivated to be able to show our movement here, to have the confidence to do daily updates and show what was happening. And also seeing that what happened over there was going to happen here. They started modeling our strategies, our media strategies. And we had to higher ground for around 4 months. And I knew that by talking with them, and they were like, the government was modeling their strategies and what they were showing on the ground. So this is important what we're seeing here, because I don't know if it was arrogance or ignorance that they didn't think the world was watching. And if you look at this drone in the front, it says the world is watching, because while they were having the binoculars, or Tiger Swan was there, whether they were in mesh, whether they were in sniper mode, everything that they were showing from the violations of the FAA, FCC regulations, they didn't expect us to be programmers, drone pilots, educators, professors, doctors, lawyers. That is a process of assimilation, but by us taking back our inherent right, we indigenize those and protect our people, is what you guys are gonna see here.
I like to get close, like up in your face close. Oh!
The fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline is taking place on the ground, in the water, and in the sky. Shijee Bisneed and Myron Dewey fly their drones over construction sites of the $3.8 billion pipeline. It's nearly complete despite massive opposition from the largest gathering of tribes in history. They surveil the construction from overhead, documenting the pipeline's path through sacred sites and providing intel to protesters who call themselves water protectors.
They're actually now, this is how close they are to the river. They're building a barricade around their site. Oh, so you see that? You see that? You see that? See? It just got hit. Whoa, it got hit again.
Their drones are often shot at by police, who, along with private security, are a constant presence around this portion of the 1,172 miles of pipeline. On a night when police shot water protectors with tear gas, rubber bullets, and water cannons in freezing weather, Myron and his crew provided live aerial views of the scene.
what we have is percussion grenades being thrown. We have the police are right down there in the front. They're spraying water with LRADs. Continue to share as fast as you can.
They're trying to hit me. Hold on, I gotta get out of there.
They're trying to hit your drone?
Yeah, they've already shot me twice.
Go straight up.
I'm doing it.
Okay.
I'm getting away.
But keep the camera on them no matter what. Keep the camera on them. So this is one way they keep us from documenting.
Just shoot our drones.
This is what we're looking at the footage the last hours after this, 24 hours, looking at the footage, looking at the human rights violations, looking at them officers shooting people with their hands up. But the most disturbing thing, I think, that we're witnessing is that they're shooting them in the back as they're running. Omane.
On Facebook, Myron's page, Digital Smoke Signals, has become a main source of breaking news around the No Dapple fight.
Digital smoke signals, and we're doing a non-violent direct drone action. As a non-violent direct drone action issue, we're seems that we're doing is breaking the rules, but we're not breaking the laws. We're breaking the rules in investigative journalism. We're documenting everything that they're doing by drilling in the drilling pad when we're not supposed to, going through sacred sites. They have been violating tribal laws and the Treaty of 1851. And then we take it to an intellectual action and using social media and put it out there in a way for our lawyers to articulate it up in DC. So they told me to get down there. They told me to get down there is what they said. They want me to get down there right now. They're gonna take me, yeah, let's go.
Taking back our burial site, so let's get out of here.
Try to make sure we're ready to go.
The role I play is pretty much the eyes of the sky. The other day, as the actions were going on by the water there, a lot of people told me that they felt safe that there was a drone just hovering above them and watching what's going on. So in a way, these drones are like protecting the camp, the people, the actions that the police officials have been doing against us. It's dangerous, I know the risks, but you know, that's just what fills me to do it actually, you know, because I'm a local. I've been here, I've been flying drones before all this blew up, and I got the first footage of the first week as the front lines there, and from that on, I just was just dedicated to keep doing this.
Powerful.
They were shooting at it today?
Yeah, well, it only got hit a couple of times, but I've got stronger tape on it now.
Wow.
But my camera's getting messed up.
Myron is now facing charges for flying these drones.
I got a charge for stalking Dakota Access Pipeline mercenaries out there. We're still under investigation. We still haven't got all our charges. The key point is it leveled the playing field, is that with this type of technology, as a consumer technology, we follow the rules to a T of the North Dakota laws, the FAA regulations. I knew when I got here that I was gonna have to legally provide representation because I was prepared to be up against that. What I was witnessing was the police inaccuracies, police fabrication, the police brutality, the stalking, but also the militarization of untrained officers with weapons is what we're seeing. Inciting a riot came from the police side because these guys are untrained and they're using the indigenous people here and all the water protectors and supporters as their training ground. They're like, oh, these are just a bunch of Indians. They don't have anything. Well, this is the second decade of the 21st century and this is not our first ride. We've been dealing with colonization for 500 years. Not only are we decolonizing and retraditionalizing here, but we're protecting ourselves as tribal government members and tribal members throughout Indian country. So yes, we do have the technology and we've been documenting it from day one. So with that, I was thinking about what they did, the no-fly zone, and I spoke with the FAA, and they asked me to ask all the drone pilots to not fly, like I had some magic power over all the drone pilots. And they denied that the officers were shooting the drones. And so I was already ready for that. We're already ready for the lies. And I showed him, and I says, now you're an accomplice. Now you know that they're shooting drones. The next day they took down the no-fly zone. And so we did everything we can to push the envelope to hold them accountable and to show people that there was Tiger Swan out there, there were mercenaries. But also we had our own like special army of collective of Marines, Army, also mercenaries, Navy SEALs, Green Beret, all these different collective that came and shared their heart, their knowledge and their training on how to protect ourselves from them, and apologizing for what they were witnessing, and to also put their bodies in the front, which I thought was very powerful, and to stand in front as much as they could and offer as much as cleaning the kitchen or washing dishes or running the donation tents. And as we stood together and wearing the same clothes from donations, and some people did donate their 70s clothes. So one of the things not to do, guys, is throw in bell bottoms, because some of them guys are from Burning Man and they wear them. So, but it was beautiful to hear their stories and how they shared why they were there and why it was important for them to be there, and how they were hoping whatever they learned that they could prevent it from happening again. And so I've seen many people on both ends cry. I documented officers crying, and I also documented officers laughing, where one instance it took me out of character in the front, and I had a hard time with it because I became pretty involved right off the bat when they were coming through the North Camp, the treaty camp. I stepped out of my role and didn't even realize it. When his mask dropped, he was smiling, and it just got me so angry that I was willing to get arrested. And I didn't go there to get arrested. I went there to document and protect our people. But it made me so hurt from what I witnessed and what I seen that I just started, I didn't know what I could do, and he wasn't listening, so I started talking to his spirit, because I know his spirit was listening. And then another officer behind him, it was a black officer. There was 2 black officers. One of them that we know now, and he did a lot of the damage to the water protectors. He was a really big black guy that I would quote from Tupac, not every brother is a brother. And he's tried to incite a lot of violence from water protectors. He tried to make them do things or say things. The things that we heard from Tiger Swan also saying what they were going to do to our women and raping our women and going over the radio channels. They used their expertise, their training that they got from this government to really try to hurt us in ways that almost you could feel powerless sometimes, knowing that they had infiltrators in the camp and that those infiltrators were in the camp. And when we documented them, some of them were chased out of camp, high speed on their own vehicles. Some of them left voluntarily before anything happened because it was a nonviolent place to be. And those infiltrations came from different areas, from media, from on the ground, from military. So when the veterans came, I was really worried because you can almost blend in. But the veterans had a different look on that were there with their heart, had a different look in their eyes. And so you could really see that they were heartfelt, the compassion that they had, and sharing their message, sharing their training while they were there. The churches that came, for me as a historical trauma trainer, I remember crying when I heard him share his story about the apology that, we came here to witness Indigenous people pray, not witness to the Indigenous people, and to share that story. And the next day, when we're standing at the front line, I says, hey, brother, why don't you come up here and pray? He goes, hey, Myron. He goes, we're not trying to get political here. I said, well, I didn't know praying was political. Is it, that conversation we had is like, you always talk about God. Well, we're talking to God. Let's go talk to God, Creator. And the next day I saw him, he rolled up his arm and he goes, Myron. And he pulled up his arm and he had the attorney's number on his arm. And I thought, wow, that was cool. He says, we're going up to pray to the governor up in Bismarck. And I believe they went to jail. And the only Indian guy with them, they tried to take him to jail and they protected him. So there's many stories like that I witnessed, especially with allies who made it a point to not let Indigenous people get in jail, because we know that when we hit that colonial system, it is not for us. With colonial judge, law enforcement, it is not for Indigenous people. We're not going to get a fair shake in there. So any of you law students, pay attention to North Dakota right now, because there's around 300 that are still going through the legal system. We've seen the violations of the due process, the Constitution. And also, it's for any law enforcement that's sitting amongst us, go and pay attention to your brothers over there and see that they have not done their homework or right homework or documenting correctly with the millions of dollars that they supposedly got for equipment. They bought toys, is what they did. And so with that, with the no-fly zone, they tried to use one of our drone pilots and say that it was because of his drone going in front of an aircraft. Well, we documented that because of our footage and protecting ourselves, we documented the officer telling him to fly over 500 feet, which is in violation of the North Dakota law to fly your drone, an unmanned aircraft. And we also seen them try to steal that drone. But they used that quote, that drone day, to get the no-fly zone, which showed they violated many, many laws along the way and bent the laws with the FAA. And so with him showing that footage, showed all the charges, which he was looking at 7 years, were dropped. And I felt very humbled, because, you know, that was the goal, is to continue to train drone operators to protect themselves, to protect their people out there, and also to protect the movement, people's rights, constitutional rights, and your all inherent right to have clean drinking water. Thank you.